Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. This is all about the trouble with Dendrobiums. And really, it's just because it's such a vast genus. There are so many Dendrobiums in amongst this group. And although they come from a similar area, you know, you're sort of starting from India and then across through, you know, Burma, Malaysia, the Philippines, southern China, right down into northern Australia, that sort of circle or oval shape round there. Within that, there are so many different environments, and that's really the differences. And I mean, most of them are really tropical forest plants. So you're looking at an evergreen forest, yeah? So you can just ask yourself, what light levels will a plant like that get? Unless it's hanging out the top of the tree, you know, sort of 50 foot up in the air or something, then it's going to be shaded most of the time, yeah? And that's where some people, I think, might make a little bit of a mistake with some of the Dendrobium types, because they're under the impression they need high light all year round. Well, they don't, quite honestly. They don't need Cattleya light. Those that come from the tropical forests are under a leaf cover of some sort. They may get splashes of sunlight through the canopy now and again, but generally speaking, these are not highlight orchids. So that's sort of point number one. But then you've got to switch your mindset to some come from deciduous forests. Well, what is the light level like that there during the growing season? Well, it's the same, isn't it? You've got leaf cover. Yeah, so they're shaded, unless they're hanging out the top of the tree. Now, there are some Dendrobiums grow on rocky outcrops, and some of those are in full sun. Oh, they make it, but there aren't so many of those, and you're less likely to come across them, quite honestly. So, you know, you're looking at forests. Now, a few come from the cooler forests, the montane forests. Well, again, they're not going to get a lot of light, but boy, are they going to get high humidity, and they're going to be cooler. Yeah, so there are some cooler growing Dendrobiums. I don't think there are any you would class as cold growers, but cooler, yes, yeah, and much higher humidity. So the easy way to think about Dendrobiums, if you don't want to work hard and struggle, is go for the ones from the tropical forests, because they're the easiest. And quite honestly, all you've got to worry about then is what happens to your environment in the winter. Yeah, now mine I allow to cool right down. Yeah, so some of mine that come from the warmer places, the tropical forests, struggle a bit in the winter, but they respond to those lower temperatures by just slowing right down, and in the main they stop growing. So they take advantage, like most orchids that we own, of what we call the growing season, our summer season, where we've got the best light, yeah, and they respond to those longer days and better temperatures day and night. That's just what happens under normal circumstances, and they grow. And my favourite expression, when they're growing, feed and water well. I mean, certainly mounted Dendrobiums, it's impossible to overwater them. You know, they're going to dry in a day, and they like that. They like that absolute soaking followed by drying off quite quickly. They like that. The places where they come from in the growing season, you know, they would get tropical rainstorms, you know, the monsoon type stuff. And somebody said at the Orchid Society meeting, a day's rain in places like that is the equivalent of chucking a bucket of water over your orchid. It really is intense. So, you know, you just can't give them too much water. And don't forget, in the wild, they get rained on, they get absolutely soaked. The whole plant, everything is soaking wet after those rainstorms. They really do get wet. But they've got air movement, they've got temperature. Yeah, so they dry quite quickly. That's what happens. But you've got those from the deciduous forests. They don't normally get quite such deluges of rain. It's the nature of the environment. And the one thing that changes those is in autumn the leaves drop. and the temperatures do drop down quite a bit more than you would get in a tropical rainforest. If the temperatures drop right down in a tropical rainforest, it wouldn't be evergreen because the trees couldn't cope. It's also a drier season. Even in a tropical rainforest, there's far less rain through those winter months. There isn't no rain, but there's far less. So although the trees can maintain their leaf cover, and those orchids could tick over, possibly push out some new growths during that season in that environment. But in our environments, that's far less likely. They're liable to slow down as a response to the shorter days and certainly the lower night temperatures and, you know, the lower daytime temperatures as well. So they'll slow down. And therein lies the problem with the care. Is when they've slowed down and they've effectively stopped growing, they really don't need much water and virtually no food because they're not growing. There's no new root growth, you know, there's no spikes, there's no new growths. They're not dormant, they're just on hold for a bit as a response to the environmentals that are going on around them. And then what I do is I then split them into annually deciduous. Now they're special. If you've got an orchid that's annually deciduous and it dumps all its leaves into the autumn and through the winter, you can virtually guarantee that comes from a deciduous forest. Yeah? And it's following the pattern of the trees that they grow on. So the trees drop all their leaves and they drop all their leaves because the environment is harsher and they can't maintain those leaves through that period. So they dump them. Yeah? And those do go into the true rest. But like with everything, there's always exceptions. There are some that if you don't give them that winter rest, they won't bloom, either at all or not very well. And yet they don't drop their leaves every year. So you've got to get to know the individual plants. I mean, some examples. The Nesta, which is an anosmum cross. It's an anosmum cross with Parishii, I think, from memory. I'm not looking it up. And the anosmum itself, they're annually deciduous. I mean, this plant here, the anosmum, has no leaves on it whatsoever. And it hasn't even started its new growth yet. It's leafless, totally leafless, but it's a mass of blooms. Yeah? And the Nesta, that's got one new growth starting at the top, but otherwise it's totally leafless. The Lodigessii over here, sorry I'm moving a bit quick. This is virtually annually deciduous. Last year's growths are sort of these, and although they may still have an odd leaf, dump the flower, why don't you? They haven't got many left. Yeah? Others, the Kaneko up here. This does eventually have leafless canes, but that takes a couple of years, so it holds its leaves longer than 1 year. This one here, the Findlayanum, with the lovely shaped canes, bulges on the canes, that's far from annually deciduous. That holds its leaves a good 2 years. But if it doesn't get rested, it doesn't bloom very well. Yeah? So you've got to sort of think about where the origins of the plant. I mean, the one tucked up in here that's coming into bloom, the Hercoglossum, that takes 3 years to lose its leaves. And then you get the Dendrobium phalaenopsis type. They can take 4 or 5 years before the old canes actually eventually drop their leaves. And if kept in really good condition and grown really well, they hardly ever drop their leaves. Yeah? The Latorias will eventually drop leaves on older canes and have some leafless canes, but it's far from annual. You know, you're looking at a good few years before they get to that state if they're grown well. Yeah? So that's the thing. It's what type of forest does this Dendrobium come from first? First and foremost, that's your first question. And if it's a deciduous forest dweller, then it's going to need the brightest light you can give it in the winter. You have to bear in mind all the leaves have fallen off the trees they're growing on. So if the sun comes out, they're in it, yeah? As opposed to a tropical rainforest, there's leaf cover there year round. Now with the annually deciduous and those that come from deciduous forests, that bright light in the winter is paramount. that is really important to trigger the blooming. It's not an instantaneous thing. Obviously the leaves are probably dumped during November, and it takes a month, 6 weeks, or even 2 months to actually trigger the blooms. But combined with that is the lower temperature. So, you know, those do need that proper rest. And you can trick these, yeah, to give them the brightest light in the winter to the plant and the sort of trigger mechanisms and responses it can have to its outside environment. They can be tricked. And the trick is, during the growing season, they would be under the leaf cover. Keep them quite shady. Yeah? And then the difference between their growing season and the brightest light you can give them is more dramatic. If you keep them in really good light all through the growing season, when you get into our winter, the difference isn't that great. The sun's much lower in the sky, you know, you've got a lot less light available. So keep them shadier in the winter. In the summer, in the growing season. And then when you get to the winter and you give them the brightest light you can, the difference is relatively greater for the plant. So the plant's more likely to respond. And I mean, apart from that, you've got to think of your winter conditions. Those warmer growers that are in the tropical rainforest from relatively low elevations, don't forget elevation comes into this as well. You know, you can be up the top of a mountain on the equator and need your hat, coat and gloves on in the middle of the summer. It's high. Higher you go, cooler it gets. So elevation does come into it. It's not just the country or area that the plant comes from. But if it's in a tropical rainforest, it's not going to get cold. That's the thing. So you have to look at those types, like the Latorias, the Dendrobium phalaenopsis types, and some others. They come from those areas. They don't get too cold in the winter at all. They do get a drop in temperature, but it's not dramatic. Yeah? And if those conditions are maintained, you could class those as continuous growers. Yeah? They might slow up a bit, but in my environment, they slow down to a standstill. And last winter, mine were in a media such that they stayed wet too long, and they suffered. I've lost some roots, I've had leaf fall that I shouldn't have got, you know. So you have to work out, you know, your own environment and what's going on. Your nobly hybrids, I wouldn't say nobly species, because that does need the proper treatment or you're likely to never see any blooms, but the hybrids are quite tolerant. But they will bloom better if you treat them like you would an annually deciduous one, even though they don't drop their leaves every year. But, you know, when they're in their growing season, they don't need bright light. And, you know, keep them relatively shady. Feed and water well. Get those canes as large as possible. And then as you go into the autumn, go into the autumn, you can slow it down. Yeah, your day lengths are going to get shorter, night temperatures start dropping down, and then if you can find them somewhere quite a bit cooler for their winter months, December, January, they'll respond better by blooming better. Yeah, but during that period, they really aren't going to need much water at all. I don't class it as a true rest, but it's not far off it. And if you can whack that light level up during that period, you'll get a better blooming. Yeah, but the nobly hybrids in the main, even if you can't do that in the winter, you're still going to get some blooms. They won't not bloom at all. The reason for not blooming at all is normally a very unhealthy plant at the time it comes to the blooming season, you know, sort of into February, March time. And if it's an unhappy plant at that point, it may not have the strength to bloom, and that might not be the treatment it got in the winter. It could just be that plant. Yeah. So anyway, a chat about Dendrobiums, and my advice with Dendrobiums is don't be frightened of the flipping things. The worst that can happen is a lovely big strong healthy plant with loads of growths and no blooms. That's the worst that can happen. Yeah. The next worst that can happen is you get some blooms, but it's not perhaps as good as it should be. It might be that that'll do. given your conditions, that's the best you can do. Well, that's fine. You know, they don't all have to be blinking show performers, you know. You can be, you know, you've got a Phalaenopsis type Dendrobiums, you could be happy with one spike in the spring and think, oh, that's smashing, oh, look at these lovely blooms. The fact that the spike's only got 4 blooms on and it should have 12, how much of a big deal is it? Well, that's down to your own view, your own sort of opinion. But anyway, it's the main difference is the tropical rainforests, they don't need high light ever, yeah? The deciduous forests, shady during the growing season and the brightest light possible during the winter months. Yeah? And if they're annually deciduous, they really do shut down in the winter and you need to accommodate that environment for them. So cool, brightest light possible and the bare minimum of water and absolutely no feed. You know, by the time you get to about January, what would you be feeding? There's no leaves left. So you've got to look at the logic. Yeah. So don't be frightened of Dendrobiums. Latorias can be very rewarding simply because the blooms last absolutely ages. And there's some weird and wonderful blooms in that group. Yeah. The black hair type, there's some smashing blooms in amongst those. And they're the same. If you can keep them warm through the winter, they won't slow down as much. Mine slow right down. They stop growing. They don't do anything in the winter. So, you know, the expression drier in winter means exactly what it says on the tin. You keep those wet when they're not growing, you get root loss. So just adjust as you go along. Things like the aggregatum, or Lindley, I must start calling it because that's its proper name nowadays, and the Jenkinsii, things like that, they don't dump their leaves every year. My Jenkinsii holds its leaves for 3, even 4 years. It still needs a winter rest though. And in that resting period, it's got what's stored up in the pseudobulbs, and probably the leaves, as storage organs, and it's stopped growing. It's doing nothing. So the only water it needs is enough to just maintain that, and no more. Yeah? So that's some thoughts on the Dendrobiums. And you know, each one might be very slightly different to the one it's sat next to, but it won't be vastly different unless it comes from one of those 2 forest types. Deciduous forest, it's going to need that bright light. It's going to need to cool down because that's where it comes from. Tropical forests, dependent on your environment. You know, in a home where it's not going to cool down that much, it might carry on growing through the winter. Well, if it's doing something, then it's going to need some water and feed, isn't it? If it's not doing anything at all, then it don't need much of that at all. Yeah? So look at your plant. Yeah? Let your plant decide. When in active growth, feed and water well, especially if you've got good temperatures and long days. We're up to, we're heading towards 15-hour days now. There are no plants in here, in the wild, irrespective of hybrids. They've still got species backed up behind them somewhere. None of these orchids in here have ever seen a 15-hour day. Ever. It doesn't happen where they come from. About 13 and a half is as long as it gets. But the sun's stronger during those days than it ever is in the UK because it's higher in the sky. But then if they're under the leaf cover of the trees, does it matter? Yeah? Rhetorical question. Yeah, so you know, we got to take advantage of our relatively short season in places like the UK. So once these growths start, you've got to bully them into growth, you know, feed and water well. Get those canes, pseudobulbs and the like as big and plump with as many leaves as possible. They'll respond by blooming better because they're a stronger, healthier plant, especially if they're going to go into a winter rest. The bigger and stronger they go into that rest, the brighter and more cheerful they will come out the other end. Don't rest a weak plant. If your plant's struggling, then don't rest it. Try and keep it warmer. Try and keep it ticking over. Yeah, don't treat it harshly, even though it might get that harsh treatment in the wild. Yeah, so Dendrobiums, don't be frightened of the flipping things. I mean, quite honestly, I look at it like this. If you can grow cattleyas, and they're, you know, in amongst those are some fussy ones, especially when it comes to repotting. You know, you can ruin your root system by doing that at the wrong time. You'd have a job to do that with a Dendrobium. They're not quite so fussy about root disturbance, you know, and give them a go. They're very rewarding. I mean, to have something like this, albeit not lasting that long, you know, and I mean, if this isn't even a large mature plant yet, and I think I've only had this 3 years now, and at the moment I've only got one new growth, which at the moment is incredibly disappointing, because last year I had 2. These are the 2 that are in bloom. The others are the previous years. Yeah, but if I only get 1, then I'm only going to get 1 set of blooms next year. So you know, hopefully something will happen. My anosmum grew 1 new cane last year. Yeah, and that's the cane that's blooming. At the moment, it's got 0. Oh, I was just going to say it's got 0 new growths, but I can just see 1 starting. So at the moment, we have 1. Now, on the anosmum, I'd like to see 2. On the Nesta, I'd like to go back to 3. Because the first year, after the first growing season, I bought it in bloom, 1 cane in bloom. It grew 3 new canes. Now, they weren't full length, but I had 3 and they all bloomed. The following year, 2. Longer, yeah, and bloomed. So this year I'd like to go back to 3 for progress. If I get 2, I'll be happy. If I only get 1, I won't be. And then I'll have to question, well, why is that not producing the new growths? Perhaps it's got too many old canes. I'll have to have a think. But at the moment, I'll wait and see. In fact, I think I can see a 2nd new growth just starting, but we'll wait and see. My aphyllum, that was a single kiki. Well, you know, that grew 2 new growths, and now it's got more. Yeah, so progress. But in theory, in our sort of climate and our sort of environment, if you've got an annually deciduous plant that grows a couple of new canes each year, you're not doing bad. But it would be nice to see 1 more cane each year. That would be classed as progress, or at least maintain the number of canes you had the previous year. But producing less canes as the plant progresses is not really progression. So, but it could have just been a bad year. You know, didn't get very nice weather. It was cooler than perhaps it was the year before. There will be environmentals, I expect. So anyway, chat about Dendrobiums, and they are rewarding. You know, there is a vast array of assortments, and I must admit, I'm always pointing the camera at the big stuff. Oh, you'll like this. The orchid, the Chrysium, that was the reason for the big box, wouldn't be anymore. Is that a haircut? So I'm getting fed up with those canes knocking stuff over. And I think they are non-productive canes apart from producing kikis. I don't think they're ever going to bloom, so I've hacked them. The plant is much more manageable now, and it's got plenty of new growths coming, so we'll see what it does now. It can put that energy in, instead of trying to store stuff in all those old canes, it's only got half of them now, so the rest of it can go in the new stuff. That's my theory anyway. But they're not all large, you know. You've got this little fleckery here. That's not a large plant. That's about as tall as it's ever going to grow. Got some buds to open soon. Some of the Latorias are quite small. Some are larger. Lodigessii is never going to be much of a giant unless you grow it flat and allow the kikis to root and become proper plants, in which case it can expand. But in that case it will be a large flat plant. It wouldn't be a tall plant. Yeah, I mean, there are some big ones. There are some tiny ones. Yeah, that's a true miniature. These are the new growths just coming out. Yeah, and this is as big as they grow. So it will get bigger, slowly but surely. Maybe one day it will bloom. But I haven't had that long. Yeah, so you've got different sizes. Some of the nobiles can be quite short. I mean, this Phalaenopsis that's in bloom over here, Phalaenopsis type Dendrobium, that's a tall one. You know, those canes are probably 18 inches long, so that's quite a tall one. But they're not all that tall. You know, some of them are smaller. Obviously the big bush is what it says it is, and that's not even a big one. I would class that as a medium-sized version. So there are some giants in amongst them. This is a tall nobile, the prima donna. The old canes on there give a clue as to how tall it can get. So they're not all small plants. This little stardust firebird, canes on that, probably 10 inches, maybe 12 inches. That's not a giant, but it does a mass blooming. Yeah. So, yeah, so many different types, so many different styles of blooms, and a multitude of choice. And you can be picky. There's enough there to be picky, and there's a lot that are available for cultivation. It's not like a limited edition sort of thing, you know, you can get at quite a few of them. But do a bit of homework, have a look at the ultimate size of the plant and think, where the hell am I going to put that? I'm not going to be able to accommodate it. Well, find a smaller one. Yeah. So, yeah, very rewarding genus. I'm classed as specialising in Dendrobiums, and that just happened. I didn't plan that at all. It just happened to be that one of the sellers I was using on eBay was providing me with quite a few large plants, and that's what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for seedlings. I wasn't looking at something I'd have to rescue. I was looking for things that were up and running, and that source provided a lot of Dendrobiums. So it just happened. Once it happened, I started looking for more. I mean, if you remember, if you've been following me long enough, it took me ages to get my first Latoria. Do you think I could find them? Or find them at a price I was prepared to pay, let's put it that way. And then they just suddenly started appearing. It's as though they suddenly became more popular. But I then found quite a few. I've now got enough. Yeah. So, and I've got enough Dendrobiums. There are none that I need, apart from I would like a good version of Victoria Regina, and I mean a good one. You can buy them, they're around, but they really don't look too clever, you know, so you're into a rescue straight away. And for me, they're not too easy because they're cooler growers, so they're not, in my growing season, they're not happy. Because they're a cool grower and it's too warm for them, so they struggle to keep pace with the temperatures, whereas they're probably very happy in the winter. But, anyway, lots of variety, lots of choices, and different care, not only depending on which forest type they come from, but also what happens in your environment through both the growing season and then through the winter period. And you would have to adjust to your winter period how you look after them. Yeah. But apart from that, you know, very rewarding. See you next time. Bye for now.